Hi.
Hello. I think Louise will start,
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
No, that's fine. So, thank you, Nikita, VAC, Tretyakov, for having us. And my friend Rio put us together, and the idea is that we have a talk and that it's quite informal. So you can also join us when you want, and if you have questions or comments, you can also join us. I think that both of us are happy to keep it quite informal, and we also don't have a plan for how tonight is going to go, so we really took Rio on his word on this being a blind date and just a conversation. And I think we both feel fairly confident that it's going to go smoothly. So we're getting to know each other as you're getting to know us. So I work with Tino Sehgal. I've been working with him for 12 years, and we're working towards some form of institution. But in Tino and my own resistance to institutionalization, I don't really have a title. So I can describe what I do rather than, so I work with Tino a lot. Sometimes we work together and sometimes I work alone, and I travel throughout the world and essentially install his work, which means that sometimes I go and visit an institution, try to gain some sort of understanding of the institution, of how it works, what its public is like, its relationship to its collection, its kind of ambition, and why they've asked us to show a work there. And then usually we choose a work that seems appropriate to that museum, and then I find the people and I teach them how to do the work. And sometimes I also do the works myself, which is actually more fun, obviously, than installing them. Installing them is very fun, managing is not as much fun. So that's essentially my role, and since I've been working with him for so long, I also, one of Tino's rules in terms of, and maybe we'll come to this later, because we both have a relationship to archives. So my relationship to archives is somehow, in a very strange way, I kind of embody Tino Sehgal's archive. So there's other people that work with us, but I work the most with Tino, and more or less all of his works reside somewhere in my body. And you're only ever allowed to teach a Tino work if you've interpreted it. So Tino has a resistance to the word performance, which I can explain later if it's interesting. So instead of using perform, we say interpret. So only if you've interpreted Tino's work can you install it. So this embodied knowledge and embodied archive is essential to his work, and probably if you're familiar with Tino's work, you also know that any documentation is strictly forbidden. And we can also talk about that maybe later on in terms of if that makes the archive stronger or weaker. It's both, I think. Hi. And so maybe I should also just explain a little bit about our relationship, mine and Tino's. Sometimes I talk about our or we, that means Tino's practice, but because I've been doing it for so long, I identify with it. So our relationship to institutions is essentially, Tino's very interested in the art museum rather than the theater, and the reason he's interested in the art museum is that historically it was a place that was made for individuals. And so in the 19th century, when the institution started to form, when the art museum started to form and becoming public institutions, it was really about educating citizens in how to become individuals. And so they would not only see the art, they would also see each other. It would, in England and in France, there were laws passed to try to encourage museums and try to encourage private collections to become public. And this was a form it was seen as some form of entertainment for the public rather than getting drunk. So it was really part of this education program. And what Tino's also interested in the museum is that people can walk around here and that you have an individual relationship to each artwork, and it's usually one artist with an individual artist has produced an individual painting or a sculpture that is talking to another individual who is regarding it. So this relationship between individuals is something that he's interested in, more interested in than a place like the theater where there's one voice talking to many. You can disagree or if you want with that, but that's kind of why he's interested in the museum and why we find ourselves there. So that being the case, you know, we bring people to institutions that are not used to dealing with people. So usually we encounter the very same problems in every single museum that we work in around the world. And so a lot of that is just, we actually infiltrate into minor operations of the museum, but it's also aspects of the museum that haven't really been considered. So for example, what Tino's first kind of series of works involves museum guards. So here, for example, we have This Is Propaganda, where a guard is singing. And of course, the reason he's working with me, so he initially is interested in bringing people into this space of objects. So the art institution he sees as a temple of objects that especially becomes prevalent in the 20th century. So it's part of seeing a society as a productive society and as a society that is producing objects. And so we then produce these temples of objects. And into these temples of objects, Tino is interested in inserting some form of humanity. So his very first work is also being shown just a few halls down, where a person is lying on the floor, dancing on the floor, and there's even a label on the wall. So this relationship between human and object is very one-to-one. It's very clear. And in my understanding of how Tino works, he put this person in the museum, and then as he was kind of walking around, so a lot of what we do is also just understanding from actually being in the museum, a lot just being a person in the museum to understand how it operates. And then he realized, well, actually the museum is full of people, and it's full of museum guards who normally are invisible, and the job of the museum guard is quite strange, so the only time you notice them is when they say, please don't touch the object. And otherwise you ignore them. And so Tino's first kind of series of works is really about animating the people in the museum that are otherwise invisible. But of course what he's doing, and what we see also in works that are more complicated, especially when we work with the museum, is that these small things are, I don't know if he truly means them as institutional critique. I mean, this we can also, but there's a playfulness there, and in trying to be playful with rules, or people that are, whose job it is to kind of enforce rules, of course that's irritating to the institution. So there's an irritation there. And so we unearth a lot of these unsaid rules that institutions, that kind of become solidified in the institution, that have also become unthought. So, you know, we always, and we have actually, together with the VAC, so the VAC, maybe you've noticed them, maybe you haven't, they've also here, because the VAC is hosting us inside of the Tretyakov, so it's a very difficult relationship, of course. And so because some of our art could be seen as controversial, the Tretyakov also wanted the VAC to have their own mediators here. So we've had a whole training program for the VAC's mediators about how to become invisible, so that we don't have, so that there's not, so it shouldn't be visible that we have three institutions, if I talk about Tino Sehgal and myself as an institution too. So we're trying to make the VAC institution invisible. And of course that's maybe not exactly what they want. But in order for the arts to operate better, that's what we're doing.
As I told Louise just earlier, I am not a theoretician in any way. I am art historian and archive curator in Garage Museum of Contemporary Art. So my business is to keep the traces of art which just happened a few minutes ago. And that's how I understood that Russian art came into phase of institutionalization. A very difficult word. And it's very symptomatic that we see Foundation brought Tino Sehgal to Moscow with his works and his great projects. Exactly because this stage of development of our local Russian art is coming to the general international art scene. Because even 10 years ago, there was no such institutional structure as we have now. And for Russian artists to come into any discussion with art institutions was a very curious task because there was no institutions. There was old conservative museums of art, fine arts, like, I'm sorry to say it, Tretyakov Gallery, and I'm happy, by the way, that Tretyakov Gallery have this project in its walls, which means it grows in a progressive way. But it was really conservative just a few years ago, and it was hardly imaginable that such a work will appear in the halls in Krymsky Val. But since then, many things changed, and young artists consider now institutions as partners and oppose themselves to institutions as well. But this is a very recent phenomenon. It's really interaction between institutions of contemporary art and art world itself is a very new kind of relationships. We just start thinking about this opposition or this partnership. In 90s, I would say, our artists, and this is really interesting if we compare what you say, that Tino doesn't like to call himself performance artist. They also were against performance as a kind of art. They hated the very idea of of something to be performed. They were actionists, like they called themselves, because some of them selected a motto, let's say, which they borrowed from Goethe: poetry and truth, and nothing else. So they had to be real in a real world. They were not actors. And that's what I remembered thinking about the work of Tino Sehgal with The Lying Man. And some of you probably remember the history which happened in 1992 when one artist, young artist, which lived in Moscow, Avdiy Taraganyan, represented to his friends a performance or action which he called towards the object. He got drunk in such a way that he couldn't move. He was just lying on the floor, dressed in a white costume, suit, and that was it. So to be an object in art meant to be dead, just lie as a piece of flesh on the floor. And as I said, they didn't think of themselves as artists. But in the same time, action which I told you about happened in artist-run space. Artists themselves were created the first institutions in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and many other Russian cities. That's why the contradiction between art institution and artistic world is not so strong. Artists make their own galleries, which in a way are institutions, and they decide whom to exhibit in their space and whom they do not want to invite. That's the point. But as I said, it's a very recent phenomenon, but artists, especially young artists, started to see in institutions like, for instance, Tretyakov Gallery or Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, a kind of enemy of living art. And they don't want to deal with this because such institutions work as a repressive mechanism of exclusion and taking decisions which are not democratic. And that's why sometimes it's quite hard to show some interesting project in a museum like ours. And many artists refuse to take part in our projects because of this. They don't want to find themselves in a context which absolutely inappropriate for their art strategies. The same thing we can say about archive. As I told you, many artists consider archives as a kind of cemetery where all our boxes with documents look like coffins. And so they sometimes tell me as an archive curator that we are killing art, which lives, and when we put it in a box, we kill it. But in the same time, everyone wants to have his or her own coffin. That's what comes to my mind.
Yeah, I have a question about the archive, or the... So Tino's doesn't want to be considered a performance artist, nor does he do performance, but he does use the word performative, which is basically meaning that his work or any artwork does something. It has an effect. It is doing something. So if I understand correctly, I think it's very close to actionism, that it's active. And it's not only active, but art is activating. And so with that in mind, I think that, actually, I don't think I've talked to Tino about this, but in my mind, I think that some of his work, specifically the guard works that I mentioned earlier, might become redundant at some point, as, you know, for example, at Garage. Garage museum guards, I don't even know if you call them museum guards, but they don't look like museum guards. They dress in contemporary clothes. They're very active also. You have conversations with them.
Moderators.
Yeah, exactly. They're moderators. So they're completely... So if the museum guard becomes redundant as a museum employee, then I take it for granted that Tino's guard works are no longer necessary, because the institution has changed to such a degree that they no longer have a place there. It would be like bringing this as propaganda would be like bringing a relic into a contemporary art museum. I mean, maybe that's an interesting move, but it's a strange move. So do you, how do you feel as an archivist of actionism, or artworks that are meant to be activating?
Well, let's say that, of course, we cannot keep the piece of art together with its context. Of course, we have to reconstruct it somehow in some point, especially when we think about such movements like which we had in 90s, like Moscow Actionism, with this very, very chaotic kind of activity, because performances or actions, they preferred the word actions. They could take place anyway, at any time, and not always there was a camera around. So we just piece by piece collect this history. Photographs, videos, even text descriptions. And that's how, for instance, performance group Collective Actions, which existed since '76, is now installed into art history. And they didn't have any video camera for even 10 years, like by '85. They didn't film anything. But they were using text descriptions of their works, very precise text descriptions of what happened, what they felt during the performance, what their guests and audience been thinking during the performance. So it exists like a grand text, and strangely enough, it still impresses people. I know young artists which came to contemporary art after reading these descriptions. Knowledge comes not through the picture, but through the text. More than that, in 2000s in Moscow we had a very great movement which called itself non-spectacular art. And the task of the artists involved in this activity was to create such works which wouldn't be visible. And for instance, we have a videotape of one exhibition of non-spectacular art, and if we don't know about the context, we wouldn't understand what this videotape is about, because we see the empty hole. Of course, we put together many ways of description, including text. And that's what archival poetics is about, because it's multimedia story. And for instance, my question, probably quite naive, is about works of Tino Sehgal, how he considers himself in terms of being part of museum collection. How can he project the future of his own past? I mean, in 50 years, how people would know about his works?
No, this is a very real question. Tino recently, not this year, but recently turned 40. And so I think, in terms of personal history, I think this is a turning point where this became more of a real question. And this is also why we're in the beginning of considering an institution. It's extremely slow. That's also how he likes to operate, and that's fine. But of course he does sell his work, and his works are sold by an oral contract, so there's nothing, again, so there should be nothing material ever produced with Tino's work. That's the rule. So you have a meeting with a lawyer and several witnesses, and obviously the buyer and the seller, and the work is described, and the terms of the work are described, and then it finishes with a handshake. But he does sell his work to major institutions, and of course this meeting a novelty, so it's also, you know, people are kind of excited just by the mere fact of having such a sale go through. But of course we have to guarantee, Tino has to guarantee, you know, this is actually, I think maybe I'm officially part of one sale agreement, but otherwise I'm not officially part of it. So that's just, you know, a friendship agreement between me and Tino that I too am there to help him install a work should a museum that has bought the work want to show it again. So this is, for example, also where having a live archive, as it were, is quite is a kind of form of self-protection or conservation of the art in the truest form that Tino can imagine. So basically he's been teaching me, you know, for the last 12 years. So it's like when I install a work, it's pretty close. I mean, obviously it's the work itself, and Tino trusts me to install the work as it should be. And maybe we have slight personal aesthetic differences, but more or less, you know, because we're two different people, but I know the rules, and so I'm authorized, and so should he die tomorrow, museums that have his work in their collection, they can still be shown, because, you know, they know that they can, most institutions know that that I'm alive and have this knowledge in order to reproduce his work. And we do have to guarantee that. If somebody's bought a work, and this is the work of the galleries essentially, is to ensure that there is a longevity to Tino's work. I don't know if Tino himself is that concerned about the question. I think that he is much more concerned about his work doing something now, having an effect on contemporary society, having a conversation with contemporary society. I don't know if the question profoundly affects him, whether or not it will be there in 100 years or not. But of course, that's part of the game. And he's entered the visual art game, and that is part of the game. People now own his work, and he has to guarantee it legally. And so we're, also just for practical reasons, as we're getting older, both he and I, we do need to pass this knowledge on, and we both have an interest in passing the knowledge on so that there is this longevity. So just for practical reasons too, it definitely exists, you know. There's a guarantee.
But you said that Tino Sehgal's archive exists. And you keep their descriptions, photos, what else? No, the archive just exists in our memories. But it exists insofar as it's like Tino and I have a shared knowledge of the work. It's more than a memory, because there's also, I mean, I don't know, I saw some of our dancers enter, so they maybe have a different idea, or I'm not educated as a dancer, though I now do perform as a dancer in Tino's works, but how knowledge sits and resides within the body. So it's more than a memory, because it's, you know, sometimes also I'll do something, you know, rather than like, it's not a description, it's actually in the doing I remember what a work looks like, or what it sounded like. And then of course there's also people like Dimitri, I see, who's dancing with us, and so there's people that have been doing this work with us all over the world at this point that also have this embodied knowledge. So potentially one could also make a piece that's close to what it should be without Tino and I. That's living, an example of living archive knowledge, which is being put into body, someone's body. But at the same time, you know that probably we've heard of it, our great artist Ilya Kabakov, he had an article which he titled, "Not everyone will be taken into the future." So for him personally, and for many other artists, museum collection and archive is a way to be written or kind of included into the long art history. And in this way, how do you think with the body, how to share this knowledge of body?
I think that there's embodiment or habitus, how we carry ourselves, is also something that's inherited or is learned. And so, and at some point maybe they disappear. So I know, for example, with my mother, I'm Swedish, and I think it's slowly disappearing with me, but with my grandmother and my mother, there's a way that Swedish women of a certain class tense here, and it's a way of meeting the world. It's a way of, it's specifically a performance of femininity, of womanness, of mastering a certain stress and meeting the world with that stress. And I know it so well, and it's a very specific type of Swedish femininity that's inherited, but maybe it is disappearing with more or less with my generation. I mean, I can still recognize it, so it's probably in my body too, but maybe, you know, I don't have a daughter, but should I have a daughter, maybe it would slowly be disappearing with her. So I think that we also do inherit an embodiment, and I can say that there is a way in which Tino carries his body that I think I can almost imitate. The way he moves his body is very familiar to me, and the more dance pieces I do of his, the more that body enters into my own physicality. And I think that there's several dancers. We've brought dancers with us here to do a work at the Shushev Museum, and several of those dancers have been doing many pieces of Tino's, and I can see it also. I think all of us can kind of slightly imitate the specificity of Tino's body, and so I think that there is almost like an embodiment can be inherited or can be preserved almost in the way that language can, or maybe it's more akin to music. Maybe it's more akin to music, but it's more than, it's different. It's different than dance steps, because it's a way of carrying yourself. So it's a form of culture, I guess.
Yeah, of course, such an instant kind of art, like dance, modern dance, is very hard to reproduce or to keep the memory of it. But since we do have an access to what is called World Wide Web, an internet is a planetary archive of everything, where you cannot find the necessary thing, but it's something you cannot control. The traces of the art life, the art itself, can be found even if you forbid to make pictures. What do you think? Is it for good or for bad? I mean, this internet phenomena is a general human memory of our time. It catches our moves without asking the permission, and becomes even a grander institution than the grandest museums of contemporary art.
I haven't thought. I like the idea of thinking of the internet as something grand. I find it ubiquitous, but grand.
It's powerful.
It's powerful, yeah,
everywhere.
as a concept. Aesthetically, for me, it still doesn't speak to me. I know that another generation, with internet art and post-internet art, it means something, but for me, that aesthetic actually hasn't reached me, because I look, young, but I did grow up without the internet. So the internet first, when I came
Me too.
Yeah, at university was when I first kind of encountered, but I didn't even use it at university. It was after university, once I'd graduated, that it kind of started permeating my life. Now, I mean, I use it, I find it useful. Tino also uses it, he also finds it useful. It's difficult for me to...
No, I mean just to consider it not as a way of communication, but the way of archiving.
Yeah.
That's...
Well, it's... I don't... Well, first I was going to say that as an archive, it's... I mean, is it democratic? I don't know. I mean, it doesn't have an archivist. It doesn't have a voice. At the same time, there are certain people that have more control over what is there and what isn't there and how it is found and how easily it is found. So it seems to me that the politics that construct the internet are very unclear and certainly not transparent, at least not to me. It's not common knowledge how it works, and that seems to me to be problematic.
It's an interesting issue because for me it's so democratic that seems totalitarian. There's the whole system of internet data, which remembers everything, but very fast forgetting the very recent days. And people spend a lot of time to remind the world about themselves. But anyway, you can find anything if you would just apply some forces. And if you're trying to escape the fixation, you cannot control this, and that's for some artists it is very stressful. That's what was my point.
I mean, we've found, like in the beginning when I started working with Tino, was also before smartphones, and so taking photos or filming his work never really happened, and now of course you can't stop people from doing it. And maybe like 5 years ago we started, I remember especially at the Tate, is that 5 years? Well, whatever. At the Tate with these associations in the big hall was the first time it really became kind of problematic, and we tried to stop it. But it just becomes a weird feature of the work, and it's not, to us, it's not interesting when the idea of not documenting the work takes over from actually experiencing the work itself. So now, from our side, we don't enforce it so much. If it happens, we of course enforce it that there can't be official photography. That's very different. But if normal, everyday people with their iPhones want to take an Instagram photo or want to post something online, we can't control it, and I think it's fine, and it becomes much more of a problem should you try to really enforce it, because then it becomes, you know, that becomes an art practice in itself, and one that Tino's not interested in, you know. So then it's sometimes, I think that's always true, that sometimes in fighting something you have to be careful what you choose your fights to be, because in that moment you're also glorifying the opposition side, you know. So rather than making a huge deal about it, we can just kind of ignore it.
And this probably can be said that making selfie with someone's work in the background is a kind of avant-garde kind of dance. I always wonder, the selfie fans look really weird. Because I work in Gorky Park. Yeah. Every second person makes a selfie. I understand what you're talking about. But I always thought, maybe just being quite uninformed, that Tino's works were somehow included in a discourse of institutional critique in general. And what I said about the situation in contemporary Russian art, when institutions take their place, we start to understand the whole issue, which we never experienced before. Maybe I'm mistaken, but was in the beginning of his career something which opposed his works to the structure of contemporary dance institutions or museums as a kind of cathedrals of beauty. Was it,
I think,
relevant?
I think Tino always saw, he's quite unusual. He's quite an unusual thinker and artist in some ways. I think that he's actually always seen the institution as something useful. And so we have, I'm really becoming part of his institution. But he has a work called The Situation, which is based on the Situationists. And the Situationists always wanted to be outside of the museum, outside of the institution. And so what he does, kind of irreverently, so to say, is to bring their practice, or comment on their practice, into the museum itself. And I think that Tino's always viewed change only as possible if you work inside of the structure. I think for Tino, I feel now that I'm really speaking for him, but I think I can say that he's not, he was never interested in being outside. I don't think he saw that as a powerful position. I think he found it much more interesting to see what he could do within that. And from that, I suppose, it's like a twist on institutional critique in some ways. It's perhaps just a version of.
But it can be interpreted in another way, that when we've been working on the project Performance in Russia for 100 years, since 1913, we found that performance art in its history can be separated into two almost equal parts. One needs a stage, and another one doesn't need a stage. So the accent, the stress artists make on the staging is very important to mark a place where action will take place. Is a part of the aesthetics, as a part of form in the end. And other part consciously eliminates all traces of separation between action itself and life, and that's difference, which helps for us, for instance, to map performance art in its diversity in relation to theater. And it's interesting how you told just now about institutions as a place, not being outside, but being in a place with walls and this kind of stage. Am I right?
Yes, I think it's also a place where people visit. When you visit a museum, you also enter into a specific state of mind. I think that it's the institution performs very strongly or suggests a behavior. I mean, at this point, because we've all been raised in museums, we all went to museums as children, we all know more or less how to behave. And so I think, and obviously sometimes in Tino's work he plays with that, and he irritates the learned behavior. But I think that that's because people come to the museum with a very attentive mind. It's kind of a prime place for reaching them or speaking to people. People are awake in a different way once they've entered the museum than they would in the park. So I think that's also, that we have Tino has one work that is in a park, but it's always in a sculpture garden. We've never tried so far, well, that's, last year we were in Morocco, where also the definition of art with a capital A doesn't really exist. And there we were on the Medina Square, and it was very complicated trying to make, they understood what we did as a spiritual practice, which was also really interesting, but it definitely wasn't art. And I think it's very hard to, and maybe the conversation was not dissimilar. I mean, it's also interesting, the conversation you can have outside of an institution isn't necessarily different. And maybe, the Medina in Morocco is also very vibrant, specific space too.
And very colorful context of visuality. And I just remembered a very interesting antithesis, probably, to what we see here. Pavel Altheimer performance, which he made in '99, I guess, in Ljubljana, when day by day in the central square of the city, several people appeared in the morning. One was, I don't remember, feeding birds. Another one was reading newspaper. A couple was talking and drinking coffee. In the evening, they left the square. But on the next day, they came exactly at the same place, doing the same thing. But no one, of course, understood at the moment that this is art, because there was no frame post factum being described and filmed. It was created, but in reality, no one understood what happened. And by the way, this performance was a starting point for non-spectacular art in Moscow. I mean, it's very interesting to consider many aspects of what is happening when we see an action which is which doesn't seem art, and we aestheticize the reality itself. But in sometimes the stress on the aesthetic value of the action changes the context crucially, like the role of museum, the behavior of visitor, when he sees something unexpected and reads it as a text which doesn't belong to the traditional art and doesn't belong to life. That's what changes the status of, for instance, such a classic museum as the Tretyakov Gallery. Do you have any feedback from the public?
Well, I was just one. I find it so beautiful, the function of the museum when it works, and I mean, people don't. Yes, I have feedback, but one of my strongest moments here, actually, in Moscow, was actually like sometimes I dance Tino's first work instead of allowing, and I was doing it a few weeks ago, and it was, is it Wednesday? It's free here? Yeah, I was doing it on a Wednesday, so it was free, so it was very busy. And also, of course, the people that come to the museum on a Wednesday maybe are slightly different because it's free. And people were just stopping. I mean, there were so many people watching, and you could see, I mean, it might sound really like I'm exaggerating, but you know, I could see and sense people's minds being blown. You know, like understanding that me lying on the floor dancing slowly in slow motion could be considered art. And the only possibility of them understanding that this was art was because the Tretyakov Gallery had allowed me to lie there. And for them, you know, and I think it's actually one of Tino's most beautiful pieces, but it is difficult to understand, and you have to spend a lot of time with it to really, you know, see this landscape of a body kind of changing and morphing. And that, that an institution, that a museum has the power to direct somebody's imagination to looking at a body lying on the floor and them seeing a whole world there is incredible, you know. And I think that for the attention that a museum can provide an artist, and that I mean really a perspective, you know, for that artist should be really grateful. And you know, me as interpreting another artist's work or an artist's work, I was truly grateful in that moment. No, I have nothing more to say there. No, but it can be such a powerful tool, and I think it's also slightly ridiculous to, you know, to not understand the power of an art institution. Then of course you can play with it, and of course institutions have to be awake enough to be able to allow artists to play. So this is also something, maybe a question for you as both a curator and an archivist is, and also it's a question for me, you know, because I think one of the most, the real power in Tino's work for me is that it only exists because of freedom. So we allow, you know, the interpreters a lot of freedom, and without that it would be dead. So how do you preserve, as an institution or as an archivist or someone working for an institution, how do you preserve freedom and vitality?
Well, this is not so hard to answer because some artworks and historical points tell for themselves. I mean, the freedom is mixed up with the event itself. So when I watch now the documentation of art life of 90s, I wonder how it was possible in general. Now it wouldn't be possible at all, because now our country is much more conservative than 20 years ago, and it's all there. This air of freedom. It's just not the possibility to say something or do something, but the way people dress, the way they talk to each other, the way they look like. So I think this quite easy to be kept as well, by the way, like the loss of freedom. For instance, in archive we keep the whole score of Pussy Riot trial, all the protocols and documents related to the trial. And this is what happened when our institution, like and the country itself, loses freedom. So in fact and description of one or another fact, we already can find these traces.
And I don't know, maybe this is a stupid question, but in my experience here, in both the Tretyakov and the Shushev Museum, I actually find the public very open-minded. And I find that the regular, normal people react to the work exactly the same as anywhere else in the world, or, you know, right now we just changed last week, we're showing this variation which is quite free and quite liberating, apparently, for visitors. And they're, you know, the Russian visitors are extremely open, and they sing and they dance with us and are very open-minded. And sometimes I hear from, it appears to me that institutions here, and maybe that's true of institutions all over the world, are more conservative than the public itself.
I don't think so, actually. Public is really conservative. And very small percentage of Muscovites come to museum. For instance, we have had questioning for the visitors of Garage, and a lot of people were saying, for the first time I am in museum, for the first time in my life. It just because they came to the Gorky Park to, I don't know, to have some fun in the center of Moscow. So those people who regularly come to museum are very special. It's a very small percentage of general inhabitants of a grand city like ours. The situation in province and regions is worse. The public generally quite conservative.
And is it a problem, like, because we often get the question, or people comment to us, especially, you know, with some of the works that are more conversational and could be seen as political. I mean, but all the work is in some, or in Tino's mind, every artwork is political. But we often get the question, you know, you only reach a very small percentage of the population. And what do you do with that? And you know, and kind of we get critique for engaging in a conversation that doesn't reach everyone. And of course it doesn't reach everyone because we're in institutions, and that's okay. But how do you feel working within an institution? Is it problematic for you that only a small percentage of the population engages with what you show? Or is it okay to have a specific conversation with a certain population that's an ongoing conversation?
The point is that for a long time I thought about my own work, that I'm not working in a certain institution, although I worked in Tretyakov Gallery, in National Center for Contemporary Art, now in Garage Museum, but I thought that the place of my work is contemporary art in general. But wherever I physically sit, it doesn't matter. And I always liked to think that what I'm doing is a kind of spreading virus around myself. Like those people who come to Garage Museum for the first time in their life, they can catch this virus and will spread it around them too. And I would say also that since '91, when we found ourselves in a new country, which was not anymore USSR, but Russian Federation, 26 years ago it happened. And since then, situation changed to the better. But still, every second person asks me, what do you think about Black Square by Malevich? Is it art? So I wouldn't be very optimistic. Yeah, but we have to deal with this. And education is very important. That's why in Garage we opened the first public library about contemporary art. And that's why we established an archive to put a ground for education. Because, you know, this sounds like anecdote, but in 2000, in the year 2000, when I've been working here, we spent hours and days trying to explain the older stuff of Tretyakov Gallery, that conceptual art is art. And they didn't believe us. But the fact that we succeeded, and some conceptual art will was exhibited in these halls helped artists to go on. They felt stronger, and they could say, you see, I'm Tretyakov Gallery. I am an artist. So the institution worked as a very positive instrument of social support for contemporary artists. Because it's hard to imagine, but try to imagine that artists which deal with contemporary art aesthetics do not have any financial, social, and political support. They don't have an access to publishing and critical discursive work. They have to create everything for themselves, including the space for art. So for through these 26 or even 30 years, we made this world better. Is it the truth, do you think?
I mean, I think it's... I went to see the triennial at Garage, and I thought it was really good. And I thought that, because I thought that the artwork was also better than a lot of the work that I've seen recently where I'm from. But it's also interesting to me, and so what are the reasons? And many people say, when you struggle, then the work also gets better. I don't know, but to me, I don't know how to answer. I don't know. I'm confused and conflicted in my feelings because I am friends with a lot of young artists, and of course they actually feel, I know it's a very different situation, but they feel very unsupported in Europe. And they feel like they don't have the politics behind them. They feel like they don't have the money. They feel like they don't have the platforms. And of course, their situation is far better than it is or was here. But I know if they were here now, because we brought some of them here, they would be arguing with you that they also don't have these means.
Sure, but the difference between the repressive power of art market and the repressive power political totalitarian system is different, and the good thing is that having freedom to do anything they want, young artists now feel abandoned and unsupported by the system, which is not repressive. To be truth, it doesn't, well, they can feel free in doing what they want, but the difference is that they expect the support and they expect recognition, whereas the artists of previous generation, they didn't expect anything at all, because they had no hope. And only the fall of regime in Soviet Union brought them the possibility to travel, to challenge art world, to make their own gallery even was sometimes a task. You know that many institutionalized staff members are former artists, and they started their career as artists and turned bureaucrats because they had to, and no one would do anything except them. The point is that, of course, the contemporary art, I think everyone here will agree with me, is not the state-supported kind of art. It's still a descent to be a contemporary artist. I mean, contemporary art is a kind of political opposition to the general political course It's too much freedom within it.
And you mentioned the art market before. Now and at the beginning of your talk, and I was just interested, I'm sorry, it's an extremely ignorant question, but does it exist here? Does it operate? Because from, you know, in a European American context, the art market and galleries, private galleries, is also what produces or they're very active in contemporary art museums and building up the collections and you know.
No, unfortunately, I have to say that art market in Russia, in the sphere of contemporary art, it exists, but it's so small and weak that cannot influence anything. And really, I'm sorry to say it, it's not a question of quality of art or enthusiasm of the gallerists. And the interesting exhibitions are open every week. Young artists come from institutions which open now in Moscow. But there is no buyers, collectors. We can remember this short list of those who buy art, and this is it.
And why? I don't know if you know.
That's
this.
why, because...
Why is it different than China, for example? I mean, the Chinese art market has exploded in recent years.
But it started not in China. I mean, the rise of Chinese art started abroad. First collectors of Chinese art lived in Europe and America. And only then, when China understood that Chinese art is a capital, is an investment, they started support it. And absolutely doesn't matter how ideologically contemporary art is an alien to the Chinese politicians. But in Russia, ideology and politics comes first, in the first place.
But could the same thing happen potentially? Would it be welcome for the Russian art scene to become more internationalized, so to say?
Yeah, of course. Of course. That's what we dreamed about for years. Like, for instance, to have Ministry of Culture more supportive, to see how the state supports the galleries. For instance, we had one gallery in the whole country, one gallery, which was invited year by year to take part in Basel Art Fair, which is very, you understand, it's not everyone can get in the list. But they had to stop, because they had no money to pay the rent, and state didn't support them, like France, for instance, which supports private institutions when they come into such a high level of recognition. Of course, we do wait, but I'm really happy that in Tretyakov Gallery we see the project of Tino Sehgal. For instance, it wouldn't be possible, as I said, like 15 years ago, just not possible at all. We had a multimedia art museum, Moscow Museum of Contemporary Art, Garage Museum of Contemporary Art, Shusev Museum, which works with contemporary art for a long time by now. Pushkin Museum have now a whole program about Western contemporary art. So we are doing well. I think.
No, I think so too. Should we open it for questions? No?
Yeah, I think because we can spin around the questions which might be interesting for us, but maybe you have a question which is interesting for you.
I want to ask you, about follow. In today talking, I listen follow words. Such words as about unusual art among young painters. That was in Moscow, Russia, in the early of zeros. I think about such periods as 1999 from middle of 2000. Tell me, please.
You mean the names?
Mm-hmm. Not at all. Although I want now. What you can to recommend me about history of this movement and likes еще что мне хотелось бы узнать точнее. Так, вот, именно какие музеи, архивы, места по всей этой тематике.
Последнее, простите.
По всей этой тематике.
Я буду, наверное, тогда отвечать по-русски. Окей?
Yeah, sorry.
Вы спрашивали про нон-спектакулярное искусство, верно? Ну, они называли себя не нон-спектакулярное искусство. Это была довольно большая группа художников, но текстов осталось немного. Есть обширная статья в журнале «Арт-хроника» за 2003 год. Номер сейчас я не скажу, не помню. Есть маленькие каталоги выставок «Стопроцентное зрение», галереи Реджина. И некоторые материалы на сайте Анатолия Осмоловского osmopolis.ru. И у нас в архиве музея «Гараж» есть видеозаписи выставок, которые проводили художники. И есть еще каталог группы Escape, которая многое внесла в историю нон-спектакулярного искусства. Это тоже можно посмотреть и почитать у нас в библиотеке. Каталог группы Escape. Библиотека музея «Гараж».
Okay.
Нон-спектакулярное искусство.
Okay. Buyers in our country, and in my opinion, this is the problem of our education system. Do you think it is possible to change our education system in the right way to help people understand the art, modern art?
The point is that it changes, but
Really slow.
the next generation probably getting money from business will spend this money buying art. But businessmen who started their capitals building in the end of 80s, they don't understand this art. It doesn't speak to them at all. They like landscapes, traditional portraits, and it's quite hard to explain them that young artists make something which is very good to invest in. But in the same time, I should say that number of art lovers in this social sphere grows a little bit, but interestingly, not because they still have the idea of investing into art or because they like the art. They understood that collecting contemporary art means to be a part of the great society in the West. You can be multi-millionaire, but if you don't understand this issue, if you are not a member of how it's called, trustees of MoMA, for instance, or Tate Gallery, you are not interesting person. And all these people started traveling to Venice, to Kassel. They started reading about contemporary art. Maybe step by step our market will grow. But still, these people, they prefer to buy Western art, not Russian. And this is very sad, unfortunately.
Good evening. Я буду по-русски, если можно, это правильно перевести. Как фотограф я уже увидел краем глаза перформанс «Поцелуй», и у меня возникло ряд мыслей, с которыми я хотел бы поделиться. В истории фотографии есть два фотографа, которые снимали поцелуи. Это очень известная фотография Роберта Донау, которая так называется «Поцелуй», которую он снял пару в Париже. Был большой скандал, когда выяснилось, что эта фотография была сделана не украдкой, то есть она была постановочной. То есть он специально нанял актеров, которые ему позировали, но его мастерство заключалось в том, что он сделал ее так, как будто бы она выглядела непостановочной. Русский фотограф Георгий Розов также занимался съемкой поцелуев. У него эта серия называется «Москва для поцелуев». Честно говоря, я просто работал в одной компании, когда они продавали открытки с этими, изображениями различных пар, целующихся в Москве. Я не понимал, кому эти открытки нужны. Кто будет их покупать, каких-то незнакомых людей, которые целуются? Это не их, это же это не их собственная фотография на память. Это просто какие-то незнакомые люди. Ну, он считал, наверное, это искусством, раз они решили печатать открытки. Хотя это также были специальные актеры, специальные модели. Это не были фотографии, они были постановочные. То есть в этом не было, как фотографии, они не ценны. Вот. Но тут стоит такой вопрос рамок. То есть фотографов часто допускают снимать что-то, и это получается постановочным, это получается искусственным. И лично у меня, как стрит-фотограф, это вызывает отторжение. Потому что и многие фотографы современные, они забывают, что ценность фотографии именно состоит в схваченном моменте. То есть, когда ты его успел схватить, а не кто-то за тебя его организовал. И когда я увидел вот эту пару, целующуюся там на полу, я тут же скинул свой фотоаппарат, но я не понял, что происходит. Я думал, что они на полном серьезе, то есть решили заниматься любовью на полу. Вот. Поэтому я считаю, что помимо того, что это не спектакулярное искусство, я думаю, что это отчасти провокативное искусство. Но суть в том, что тут возникают такие вот рамки, подбежал ваш смотритель и запретил мне снимать, что я, в принципе, к чему я не был готов. И, то есть, я к чему подвожу? На мой взгляд, то есть, его нельзя назвать просто спектакулярным. На мой взгляд, оно гораздо шире. Тут оно поднимает многие философские вопросы о границах, о том, что нам разрешено видеть, что разрешено снимать или не разрешено. Вот. И, на мой взгляд, оно является философским искусством. Это даже, я не знаю, вот у меня есть знакомый, который в школьные годы был рэпером. У него была в одной из его песен была фраза: «Иногда я вижу то, что не должен видеть». Вот мы, фотографы, иногда видим то, что мы не должны видеть. вернее, то, что, может быть, другие не должны видеть. Даже если мы это сфотографируем, мы не всегда имеем право или там какие-то у нас этические нормы, не всегда можем это показать. И, на мой взгляд, то есть вот это искусство, оно поднимает как раз эти вопросы, вопрос этики, философские вопросы. То есть можем ли мы вторгаться в чужое пространство, можем ли мы снимать его, фиксировать, показывать другим. Может быть, это просто у них такой порыв, да, и я считаю, что это гениально просто. Спасибо.
Я хотела просто прокомментировать, может быть, вот двойственность современной фотографии, которая, наоборот, в значительном количестве случаев предпочитает постановочность. Именно она и ценится, да? А с другой стороны, я вспоминаю слова Игоря Полимина, может быть, вы знаете такого фотографа, который рассказывал мне о своей, ну, как бы о фотографическом сознании, скорее, чем о аппаратуре или особой оптике. Он говорил, что у него наступил такой момент, когда он полностью превратился как бы сам в камеру. И даже когда у него не было в руках камеры, он делал вот так. У вас особый образ видеть, способ видеть.
Ну да, мы мысленно фотографируем, даже если не мысленно мы фотографируем, даже если нам не удается расчехлить фотоаппарат, то есть здесь нажать кнопку затвора, да.
Значит, в вашем личном архиве уже есть фотографии работы Тино Сehgala.
Она есть, но я не смогу ее выставить, потому что они против. Поэтому здесь встают рамки. То есть я просто, она останется как добыча, как трофей, что я все-таки сумел ее сделать, пока ваш сотрудник не подбежал ко мне. Вот. Я сделал вид, что я удалил фотографию, но теперь она останется у меня. Я не буду ее стирать, спасибо. Да, и еще один нюанс. Дело в том, что мы фотографы, мы тоже, ну как сказать, у нас есть свои уловки, вот. И, ну, к сожалению, в обычных фотошколах этому не учат, вот. Это просто из личного опыта. Какой-то фотограф поделился с другим. Есть много разных способов, как снимать какого-то незнакомого человека, который находится рядом с тобой, вот. И, ну как сказать, этим секретом поделился со мной один фотограф. Мы с ним в Париже просто вместе там, как сказать, ну, побеседовали. Он сказал очень просто. То есть вот подходишь там, ну, к тем же самым целующимся людям, да, ты подходишь как турист, вот, и направляешь свою фотокамеру на какой-нибудь там, ну, там, на Эйфелеву башню или на какое-нибудь там здание красивое, как будто ты снимаешь его. И когда они уже к тебе привыкли, что ты, ну да, какой-то ты стоит возле нас, вот, снимает здание, нужно просто заранее все настроить, вот, быстро развернуть фотоаппарат, сфотографировать их и уйти, вообще ничего не рассказывая. Вот. Или, допустим, когда нас заставляют, то есть когда мы приходим, нам часто приходится снимать, ну, по заданию, то есть мы, допустим, пришли, вот, мы знаем, что тут же там к нам накинется охранник и запретит нам снимать. Мы просто входим куда-то, делаем кадр, вот. И, ну как сказать, сейчас просто в фотоаппаратах иногда бывают две флешки. Вот. Если он заставляет нас потереть с флешки, мы форматируем флешку, там, показываем ее, что она пустая, но он не знает, что есть вторая флешка. Ну или на худой конец можно всегда прийти дома.
Можно всегда ее съесть.
Даже если я сейчас сотру это с карты памяти, я могу это дома восстановить на компьютере. Поэтому я считаю так, что современное искусство, да, то есть вот эти вот ограничения, да. Ну, конечно, да, вы можете заставить, можете даже отобрать фотоаппарат мне, но вы должны понимать, что тот, кто хочет это где-то опубликовать или, не знаю, там, это все равно будет где-то в сети. То есть вопрос, как сказать, ну, как сказать, ограниченного искусства, элитарного искусства, да, то есть другие не имеют к нему доступа, они в наше время, прозрачности интернета, они очень условны. Тут вступает в силу только этика фотографа. Если он считает, что это будет неэтично, нарушает чужие границы, он не будет этого делать. Если он неэтичный фотограф, ну вот те же самые папарацци, он раз и вывесил. Поэтому тут решение границ и этики исключительно. Спасибо.
But I think it's also about when I hear you talk, it's also being a photographer is so much more than the resulting photo, and it's about the excitement of capturing the moment, the excitement of the guard stopping you, the excitement of the possibility that the guard might stop you. And I think this is, you know, some like actionist artists or like Tino, you know, they're also, this is the sphere of their art rather than the photo. It's in this experience of interaction and possible interaction and possible rules being broken, etc., etc. So it's just different spheres of experience. So sometimes possibly should you publish the photo that you weren't able to take of maybe of Dmitry and Olga, who are a real couple. So when we see Dmitry and Olga over there kissing, it's actually real. It's very real. But you know, if you were to publish such a photo, you would potentially be taking away the experience of somebody else's confusion at the moment of seeing a couple making out on the floor of the Tretyakov. So, you know, that's the reason, but it's just competing art forms.
Я просто защитил диссертацию по фотографии, вот, и просто много книжек разных перечитал, вот. И есть один автор, который говорит про ауру произведения, вот. И я считаю, что вот как раз, ну, есть Беньямин, который писал про произведение искусства в эпоху массового воспроизводства, там, репродуцирования, вот, вы знаете. Но я считаю также, что вот те же самые открытки Розова, которые были в огромном количестве растиражированы, то есть каких-то стоящихся людей. То есть аура вот этого момента прекрасного, который кто-то подсмотрел, она умирает. Даже если бы они были не постановочные фотографии. То есть когда это увидели многие люди, это уже, наверное, становится не искусством. То есть искусство, это когда ты поставил, ну как сказать, вот есть музей, куда... То есть ты должен сначала созреть, то есть у тебя должно возникнуть желание пойти туда и обогатиться, то есть зарядиться вот искусством ауры вот этой. Ты понимаешь, что только в этом, не через интернет ты можешь репродукции посмотреть, а только вот в этом месте. Я причем приехал сюда, еще потратил немало времени, вот, то есть, поэтому всегда должно быть какое-то место, где ты понимаешь, что там есть вот эта аура, только там это есть аура, не где-то в интернете. То есть в интернет ты зайдешь, это просто информативно, вот, то есть ты просто получишь какую-то информацию, но ауру ты там не получишь, поэтому я считаю, что аура, она только здесь. Спасибо.
У меня, я, наверное, по-русски тоже, да, буду тогда говорить. У меня вопрос, наверное, два вопроса даже к Луизе, я постараюсь быть короток. Первый вопрос по поводу все того же запрета на съемку. А не жалко ли, как-то, не знаю, не обидно ли лично, что вот там, не знаю, через 30 лет не останется никакой документации, там, видео, аудио, ну, в смысле видео, фотографий. Ну, понятно, что танец — это что-то более эфемерное, чем, не знаю, картина, но все равно есть там записи. А тут как бы, ну вот, может быть, что-то там где-то из-под полы снятое, но в целом как бы не будет такой какой-то документации и там, не знаю, внукам нельзя будет показать. И второй вопрос, и не знаю, может, его уже обсуждали, я просто не с самого начала пришел, там написано в анонсе такие слова, что Луиза — живой архив. С 2005 года, кажется, вместе работаете с Тино. И есть ли какое-то ощущение, как изменился, не знаю, подход Тино, что ли, к тому, что он делает? Вот какая-то динамика, вот как бы что изменилось по сравнению с тем, как было в начале и как сейчас? Да, все.
I mean, of course, me and my boyfriend, we also do kiss. And personally, as a dancer doing it, when I see photos of us on Instagram, I get a little bit proud. So, you know, there's me as like a dancer, and then there's me as working with Tino. I don't think that Tino, he also doesn't really mind, you know, when we see it just on social media and stuff like that. But of course, there used to be, I think there still is, like all of Tino's gallerists work very hard. If there's a YouTube video, it's up to the galleries, because I guess it also, I don't know how Tino convinced them that this was their job, but maybe the argument is that it somehow devalues his work. I'm not entirely sure. But so they flag it. So it's a gallery's job to actually get rid of all of the videos on YouTube. But on Instagram, I don't really know how it works. But I mean, Yes, personally for me, maybe as a dancer, it's a bit of a shame, but there's still like something different. If there is definitely a different experience, and it's a much more powerful experience when I see somebody have a reaction in front of me than when I see a photo. That is also true. Like I get much more excited when I can see somebody experiencing the work and how that's affecting them. And also, you know, if we were to perform Kiss to our grandchildren, you or us, you know, that would also be pretty exciting. And maybe it's more exciting than the photo. And about Tino's approach, I mean, it's very similar, you know, it's interesting. There was another woman in the beginning of this foundation. I don't even know if I'm allowed to like talk about it publicly, but now I am, so here we are. There's me and another woman, Cora, who was also here, Cora Gianola, who's also was installing the work, but she has children, so she's not here anymore. But her and she started working with Tino just before I did, and since then, because she had children, and not so much, and she's worked on different works than I have. But what was really interesting was, for the first time, we were working together this year, because it's the kind of, the foundation would be her and I, essentially. And the way, because we spent so much time with Tino in the early days, we work really similarly. And so how we talk to interpreters that are doing Tino's work is almost the same. And like, even our jokes aren't the same, but the type of jokes are the same, or the type of way, there's like a certain way of a very fast familiarization that we learned from Tino, and that, so there's like there's a craft to how we interact with people that's learned. And so this is very much the same, and there is like something there. Other than that, obviously, you know, because Tino's also had children and you know, I have taken over many of the jobs of installation. You know, I install much more than I used to. So there's a way that the work is becoming more independent of Tino, for better or worse. And I know that, I think it's a very complicated feeling for him. It allows him freedom, because of course he, unlike any, as far as I know it, any other artist, any other visual artist, he's really like promised himself to the seller, because he's promised that this work will exist, and because there's no documentation, he's forced to actually install it and to be there. And so he's married to his work in a way that no other artist that I know of is. You know, they actually are independent. But of course, with the introduction of somebody like me or Cora, his work slowly becomes further and further away from him. And it's been, sometimes he and I have a complicated relationship when it comes to that. You know, and for example, this variation, which we're showing at the Shushev now, you know, I've been working on that as a dancer also for many years, and it's one of the works that allows for the most freedom. So I think Tino has not been dancing in that work. And so my relationship to the work is stronger than his is, you know. So this is something that is definitely changing. It doesn't change the fact that he's the author, that he is the ultimate owner of this work, and he has the authority. But it is a complicated relationship between him and his work, and between him and I.
Скажите, пожалуйста, как происходит процесс обучения интерпретаторов, как вы взаимодействуете с ними, поскольку каждая работа Тины — это, по сути, не импровизация, это последовательность каких-то действий, движений, слов, и помимо памяти обучающего, есть, существуют ли какие-то записанные там текстом на каком-то условном носителе инструкции, записанные в текст. И вторая часть — это существует ли для Тина и для его команды, его сподвижников вообще задача сохранения этих работ и возможности их интерпретации и показа там, через условные 150 лет, и как это будет осуществляться через такое множество лет.
Different works are taught or installed in different ways. So Kiss Kiss is a very set choreography. Of course, every couple do it slightly differently. And so there, well, Kiss is kind of interesting. Also, when I teach it, because it is such an embodied knowledge, it is a choreography, but it's also not a choreography, you know, that is like 5, 6, 7, 8. And so sometimes I would just be like, no, well, wait. So if I just get on top of you, and so I do it my way, and then you can look at how I do it, and maybe you can feel how this works. So it's like really two bodies interacting, and somehow I know how that feels like, and so I can teach it that way. And then instead of allowing is about, I mean, both Kiss is a more set choreography than instead of allowing, so the two dance pieces here. But it's really about a quality of movement, both of them. But instead of allowing more is a quality of movement. So it's, our rehearsal is, it takes, for both pieces, it takes a week to learn them. And every day you enter into the quality more. And so, and this is teaching, you know, this progress, for example, which is at the Shushev Museum, which is a conversation piece, is different, but similar insofar that it is a quality. So I often talk about what I do as teaching a culture. And so we teach people the rules of the game, essentially, and then we talk about it, people try, and every day, again, it's like, it's a slow process of people understanding what they're doing. And so a lot of teaching the works is really also about people being able to ask questions and understanding why we made this decision, why have we made that decision. And only when they fully understand it can they make their own decisions within that rule structure. And the more that people inhabit the rule structure, the better the piece will be. And so it's also, you know, nice for us that people are coming back to Moscow now after their holidays, and so the work has settled into everybody's body, and so the work is for sure stronger now than it was, you know, 3 weeks ago or when it opened. And Tino's exhibitions are always the strongest at the end, because then it's really soaked into people's bodies. So it's a slow process of teaching qualities or teaching a culture and a set of rules, but also it's not only teaching a set of rules, it's about how to inhabit those set of rules. And that's maybe an advantage that Tino has over other artists who just write down instructions, for example, that not only do we tell people in the instructions, but we also tell them how to in our understanding, how to understand those instructions. And then we have an open dialogue so that they also understand the reasons behind. You know, it's very important that people understand the work that they're actually doing, and that not just exercising a certain set of commands. And of course, there is, we're working on it. This is again part of this kind of foundation or institution that we're trying to set up in vague ways that we don't know yet how exactly it'll take shape, but of how to continue teaching. And in every place where we show a work and install, you find different people who have a different affinity for the work, who like the work, whose bodies like the work, and you know, depending on their life, would potentially work with us in the future. And so the collection of people that know the work is growing and grows, and then also the number of people who know more works is also growing. So the ambition has to be for Tino that the work exists in 150 years. And essentially it's again like this culture, it's an oral culture that we're passing down somehow.